July 31st, 1966, Windsor, England, the 6th National Jazz and Blues Festival. Backstage, three men are preparing for a performance that thousands have been waiting for. One is a 21-year-old guitarist whose name is already spray-painted on London walls with the words, "Clapton is God." Another is a classically trained bassist with the voice of an angel and the temperament of a hurricane. The third is a red-haired drummer whose jazz-infused fury on the kit is matched only by the violence of his temper. They've been rehearsing together for exactly 1 month. They've already had their first fistfight. And they're about to change rock music forever. This is Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker. Together, they are Cream. And in 5 months, they'll release an album that will invent the power trio, lay the groundwork for heavy metal, and prove that three musicians playing at the absolute peak of their abilities can create something more explosive than any 5-piece band could ever dream of. But here's what nobody knew that summer night. The same combustible chemistry that made their music so electrifying would nearly destroy them all. The album they were about to create would be recorded in primitive studios on a shoestring budget, completed in a matter of weeks, and released into a world that wasn't quite ready for what it was hearing. This is the story of Fresh Cream, the debut album that defined an era, established a template that hundreds of bands would follow, and was born from a collaboration between three geniuses who could barely stand to be in the same room together. To understand Fresh Cream, you first have to understand where these three men came from, and more importantly, why they were all looking for an escape. By the summer of 1966, Eric Clapton had already lived several lifetimes in the British music scene. Born in 1945 and raised by his grandparents in the suburbs of London, young Eric had discovered the blues at 15 and became obsessed. He taught himself guitar by listening to records by Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, and B.B. King, playing the same licks over and over until his fingers bled. At 17, he joined the Yardbirds, a blues rock band that was quickly gaining attention. But as the Yardbirds moved toward a more commercial pop sound, Clapton grew frustrated. When they recorded For Your Love in 1965, a song Clapton felt betrayed the purity of the blues, he quit. His next move was joining John Mayall's Blues Breakers, a more serious blues outfit that gave him the freedom to truly explore the music he loved. It was during his year with Mayall that the Clapton is God graffiti started appearing across London. He was becoming a guitar hero, but he was also becoming restless. Playing other people's songs, following another bandleader's vision, it wasn't enough anymore. Meanwhile, Jack Bruce was taking a very different path. Born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1943, Bruce came from a musical family and studied cello and composition at the Royal Scottish Academy of Music. He was a trained musician in a world of self-taught rockers, and he brought a level of sophistication to the bass guitar that the instrument had never seen before. Bruce had played with Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and then joined the Graham Bond Organization, a pioneering blues-jazz fusion group. It was there that he first encountered Ginger Baker. And it was there that the seeds of their legendary hatred were planted. Ginger Baker, born in 1939 in Lewisham, London, was already considered one of the best drummers in Britain. He'd studied with jazz great Phil Seaman and developed a style that married African rhythms with jazz improvisation and raw power. But Baker was also a heroin addict, known for his volcanic temper and his habit of settling disputes with his fists. In the Graham Bond Organization, Bruce and Baker were forced to work together, and they despised each other. Bruce thought Baker played too loud and was too chaotic. Baker thought Bruce was too busy, playing too many notes, trying to steal the spotlight. Their arguments became legendary. During one performance, after Bruce told Baker he was playing too loud during a drum solo, Baker exploded. A bouncer had to physically pull him off Bruce before he could kill him. When Bruce left the Graham Bond Organization in frustration, he briefly joined Manfred Mann, scoring a hit with Pretty Flamingo. But he was still searching for something more. It was during this period of musical wandering that fate, in the form of a car ride, intervened. Ginger Baker came to see Eric Clapton play with the Bluesbreakers. After the gig, Baker drove Clapton back to London in his Rover. Clapton was impressed, not just with Baker's car, but with his vision. Baker told Clapton he wanted to start a band. A blues band, a power trio, just 3 musicians, each a master of their instrument, with room to improvise and explore. Clapton was immediately interested, but there was one condition: Jack Bruce had to be the bassist. Clapton had played briefly with Bruce in the Bluesbreakers and was stunned by his ability. Bruce wasn't just a rhythm player, he was a lead bassist who could sing like a soul man and write original songs. Baker's face fell. "No," he said. "What did you have to go and mention him for? We don't get on very well at all." But Clapton held firm. It was Bruce or nothing. Baker, desperate to work with Clapton, reluctantly agreed. The band that would become Cream was born from a compromise neither man wanted to make. The first rehearsal took place at Ginger Baker's house in Neasden in June 1966. Jack Bruce arrived to find Baker and Clapton already there. Within minutes, the old tensions erupted. Bruce had given an interview to a music magazine, mentioning the new band before Baker wanted it announced. Ginger was furious. The argument, Clapton later recalled, went along the lines of, "There you go, you've done it again." Clapton was confused. "I thought, wait, there's something going back here that I'm not aware of." The "you've done it again" implied that this was sort of a pattern that existed before I knew either of them. He was standing between 2 men who had years of resentment built up, and he was only just beginning to understand what he'd gotten himself into. But when they actually started playing, when Clapton's blues guitar combined with Bruce's thunderous bass and Baker's explosive drumming, something magical happened. The anger, the tension, the competition between Bruce and Baker seemed to channel itself directly into the music. They began serious rehearsals in June 1966, working through blues standards and a few originals. The name Cream was Clapton's idea, a nod to the fact that they considered themselves the cream of the crop, the best musicians in Britain. On July 29th, they made their unofficial debut at the Twisted Wheel Club in Manchester. 2 nights later came their official debut at the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival. The response was overwhelming. Here was something audiences had never quite heard before. 3 virtuoso musicians, each capable of being a frontman, playing with an intensity and volume that felt almost violent. But there was a problem. They had almost no original material. Clapton had his blues covers, songs by Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, Robert Johnson, Skip James. Baker and Bruce had a few pieces left over from their Graham Bond days. But they needed singles, they needed album tracks, and most importantly, they needed songs they could claim songwriting credits for. That's where the real money was in the music business. Baker brought in a poet friend named Pete Brown to help with lyrics, but in a twist that would cause resentment for years to come. Brown immediately clicked with Jack Bruce instead. The 2 began writing together, crafting songs that would become some of Cream's biggest hits. Baker felt shut out of his own band's creative process from the very beginning. Almost immediately after forming, Cream entered Rayrick Studios in Chalk Farm, London in early August 1966. Their producer was Robert Stigwood, the Australian-born impresario who managed the band and owned Reaction Records, the label that would release their album. The engineer was John Timperley, a quiet professional who would have to navigate not just the technical challenges of recording this loud, unpredictable band, but also the interpersonal warfare that erupted constantly. The budget, Clapton later noted, was minuscule. They were working with 4-track tape machines. Primitive by today's standards, but standard for 1966. The recording philosophy was equally simple. Run through each song a few times until you got a satisfactory take, then do minimal overdubbing afterward. Their first recording was Wrapping Paper, a whimsical music hall-influenced song written by Bruce and Pete Brown. It was deliberately designed to showcase the band's versatility, proving they weren't just another blues band. When it was released as their debut single in October 1966, it confused audiences who expected raw blues. The single limped to number 34 on the UK charts. Ginger Baker later called it the most appalling piece of shit I've heard in my life. But wrapping paper served its purpose. It got the band on television, it proved they could write pop songs, and it bought them time to figure out who they really were. After the initial Rarick sessions, the band moved to Rymuse Studios on South Moulton Street in Mayfair, a slightly better facility also engineered by John Timperley. Throughout September, October, and November of 1966, they recorded the bulk of what would become Fresh Cream. The sessions were casual, almost chaotic. According to engineer recollections, there was a lot of alcohol involved. At one point, Ginger Baker accidentally spilled Coca-Cola into the mixing panel. The band was still finding itself. They were split between two approaches: the psychedelic pop songs that Bruce and Pete Brown were writing, and the blues covers that Clapton wanted to explore. The album would end up being almost evenly divided between these two sides of their personality. The originals were fascinating. NSU was a driving rocker about venereal disease, not your typical pop song subject. Sleepy Time Time featured Bruce's wife Janet Godfrey as co-writer, a moody piece with intricate rhythms. Dreaming was a delicate, ethereal 2-minute interlude that showed Bruce's softer side. Sweet Wine, also co-written with Janet Godfrey, was a tribute to Wasted Time that featured some of Ginger Baker's most sophisticated drum work. And then there was I Feel Free. Recorded in early September 1966, it was the song where everything clicked. Starting with a cappella handclaps and Bruce's humming, it burst into a full-throttle rock tune that somehow married psychedelia with pure power. It was the perfect encapsulation of what Cream could be. Experimental but accessible, weird but thrilling. The blues covers were equally important to the album's identity. They took Willie Dixon's Spoonful, a 2.5-minute blues song, and stretched it to 6.5 minutes, building it into an extended jam that showcased each player's improvisational skills. They covered Muddy Waters' Rollin' and Tumblin' with ferocious energy. They transformed Skip James's haunting 1931 recording I'm So Glad into a roiling celebration of sound, and Clapton paid tribute to Robert Johnson with a faithful but electrified version of 4 Until Late. The album closed with Toad, a Ginger Baker composition that featured one of the first extended drum solos in rock music. Baker, who'd come from jazz, brought that tradition into rock and roll. For 5 minutes, he demonstrated why he was considered one of the best drummers in the world, building from subtle cymbal work to thunderous explosions of rhythm. The recording style was deliberately raw. The stereo mixes featured extreme panning, drums predominantly on the right channel, vocals and guitar on the left, creating a wide, immersive but sometimes disorienting soundstage. The mono versions, which many consider superior, kept everything centered and punchy. What's remarkable is how quickly it all came together. The entire album was recorded in bits and pieces over about 3 months, often with the band rushing between studio sessions and live performances. There was no time for extensive experimentation or endless takes. They captured what they could and moved on. Fresh Cream was released in the UK on December 9, 1966, on Robert Stigwood's Reaction Records label. It came in both mono and stereo versions and was released simultaneously with the single I Feel Free, which became a much bigger hit than Wrapping Paper, though it wasn't included on the UK version of the album. The anticipation was intense. This was a supergroup before that term really existed. 3 musicians, each famous in their own right, coming together for the first time. The music press had been building up the story for months. The question was, could they deliver? The critical reaction in the UK was largely positive. though not without reservations. Melody Maker opened their review by saying it was not quite as fresh as it could have been, but concluded it was still a great record. Clapton, Baker, and Bruce, working like Trojans to construct exciting, free, wild music of life, love, and soul. They predicted sensational things to come from the group. Record Mirror noted the album's very mellow and relaxed sort of music, which oozes confidence, sort of progressive British rhythm and blues. Disc and Music Echo claimed it was good, though not as good, one feels, as it might have been, not enough Eric Clapton for one thing. The album peaked at number 6 on the UK Albums Chart, a strong showing for a debut. Interestingly, over 2 years later, around the time of the band's final album Goodbye in February 1969, Fresh Cream saw another surge in the charts that placed it as high as number 7. The album had staying power. In January 1967, Atco Records released a slightly different version in the United States. The American version replaced Spoonful with I Feel Free as the opening track, which made for a more immediately accessible album. In the US, it peaked at number 39. Not a massive hit initially, but it would eventually be certified gold by the RIAA on December 3, 1968, for shipments of 500,000 units. What the chart positions didn't fully capture was the album's impact on musicians. In clubs and music schools across Britain and America, young guitarists, bassists, and drummers heard Fresh Cream and realized that rock music didn't have to have rhythm guitar, keyboards, or even a dedicated frontman. 3 people, if they were good enough, could create something massive. Jorma Kaukonen of Jefferson Airplane saw Cream perform and said, "I never saw anything like it." Future members of Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and countless other bands would cite Fresh Cream as a revelation. Proof that blues rock could be taken to new extremes of volume, improvisation, and virtuosity. To understand Fresh Cream's importance, you have to understand what it did that no one else had done before. First, it established the power trio as a viable, even superior format for rock music. Before Cream, most rock bands had 4 or 5 members. The Beatles had 4. The Rolling Stones had 5, if you counted their frequent pianist Ian Stewart. The standard rock lineup included rhythm guitar and often keyboards to fill out the sound. Cream proved that was unnecessary. With Clapton's guitar work covering both rhythm and lead, Bruce's bass providing both low-end foundation and melodic counterpoint, and Baker's drums adding not just timekeeping but a third melodic voice, the power trio format was complete. There were no gaps in the sound, no missing frequencies. In fact, the space created by having only 3 instruments made the music more dynamic, more powerful. Second, it brought improvisational jazz sensibilities into rock and roll. Baker and Bruce both came from jazz backgrounds and brought that tradition of extended soloing and rhythmic complexity into a blues rock context. Songs like Spoonful and Toad were essentially jam sessions captured on tape. Something that was rare in studio rock recordings at the time, but would become standard in the coming years. Third, it demonstrated that blues covers didn't have to be slavish imitations of the originals. The British blues boom of the early 60s had mostly been about white musicians trying to faithfully recreate the sound of African American blues artists. Cream took a different approach. They respected the source material but completely reimagined it, making it louder, longer, weirder. They weren't trying to be Muddy Waters or Willie Dixon. They were using those songs as launching pads for their own explorations. Fourth, it married blues with psychedelia in a way that created a new sound entirely. Songs like I Feel Free and NSU weren't quite pop, weren't quite blues, weren't quite rock. They were something new. Blues rock or hard rock or proto-metal, depending on who you asked. This hybrid approach opened the door for Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and hundreds of other bands who would take rock music into heavier, more experimental territory. And fifth, perhaps most importantly for the future of rock, it proved that virtuosity mattered. In the early and mid-60s, rock and roll was often seen as simple music for teenagers. You didn't need to be a great musician. You just needed to look good and play 3 chords. Cream demolished that notion. These were serious musicians who'd studied their instruments and could compete with any jazz or classical player in terms of technical skill. The album raised the bar for what rock musicianship could be. But even as Fresh Cream was winning praise and selling copies, the tensions within the band were intensifying. The very qualities that made their music so explosive, the competition, the individual egos, the need for each player to shine, were also tearing them apart. The Bruce Baker feud that had started in the Graham Bond organization continued unabated. During rehearsals and recording sessions, arguments would erupt over the smallest things. Baker thought Bruce played too many notes, cluttering up the arrangements. Bruce thought Baker played too loud, overwhelming the vocals. Both men were alpha personalities who refused to back down. Clapton found himself in the uncomfortable position of referee. He'd imagined Cream as a blues band where he could finally explore the music he loved. But Bruce and Brown were writing pop songs. Baker was pushing for more complex jazz-influenced pieces, and Clapton's vision was being pulled in multiple directions. "I thought of Cream as sort of a jazz band," Bruce later said, "only we never told Eric he was really Ornette Coleman." This fundamental disconnect, Clapton thinking it was a blues trio, Bruce thinking it was a jazz-rock fusion group, Baker thinking it was his band, would plague them throughout their existence. There were also creative credit disputes that would fester for years. Ginger Baker felt he contributed heavily to the arrangements of songs, but received no songwriting credit. He was particularly bitter about "Sunshine of Your Love," which would come later, claiming the entire arrangement was his input, but that he never received any acknowledgement. This pattern started with Fresh Cream, where Bruce and Brown received the majority of writing credits and therefore the royalty payments. And then there was the drug use. Baker was a registered heroin addict. Clapton was beginning to experiment with drugs that would later lead to his own addiction. The lifestyle of a working rock band in the 60s, constant touring, late nights, access to any substance you wanted, was not conducive to maintaining fragile interpersonal relationships. But here's the fascinating paradox. All of this conflict seemed to fuel the music. When Bruce and Baker were at each other's throats, they played with even more intensity, each trying to outdo the other. The competition pushed them to play better, to improvise more wildly, to take more risks. The music was born from the conflict as much as in spite of it. While Fresh Cream captured the band in the studio, their live performances were where they truly became legendary. And those live shows revealed something crucial. The album was just a starting point. In concert, Cream was almost overwhelming. They played loud, louder than most bands of the era. They stretched songs to 2 or 3 times their studio length. Spoonful, which was already over 6 minutes on the album, could become a 20-minute epic live. I'm So Glad would expand into extended improvisational jams where each musician took turns showing off their virtuosity. Baker's drum solos, hinted at in Toad, became showcases of percussive fury. He would build from whisper-quiet cymbal taps to full-on assaults on the kit, incorporating jazz rhythms, African polyrhythms, and pure rock power. Audiences had never seen or heard anything like it. Clapton, freed from the constraints of keeping time for a larger band, could explore the full range of his blues vocabulary. He would quote other blues songs mid-solo, reference jazz standards, or veer off into pure abstraction. His solos weren't just displays of technique. They were conversations with the audience, with his bandmates, with the blues tradition itself. And Bruce. Jack Bruce might have been the most impressive of all. He sang with the passion of a soul shopper while simultaneously playing bass lines that functioned as a third lead instrument. He didn't just hold down the low end, He competed with Clapton for melodic space, creating a push and pull dynamic that was thrilling to watch. Their early BBC sessions from late 1966 and early 1967 captured some of this live energy. Songs like Sweet Wine, Steppin' Out, and early versions of Crossroads showed a band that was still evolving, still figuring out how far they could push the blues rock format. American audiences got their first taste of Cream in March 1967, when they appeared on Murray the K's show in New York alongside Wilson Pickett. The American rock scene, already being shaken by the psychedelic sounds of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, wasn't quite prepared for Cream's attack. They were blues-based but not quite bluesy. They were loud but not sloppy. They were improvisational but not aimless. They were something entirely new. By mid-1967, as Cream was working on their second album Disraeli Gears, it was clear that Fresh Cream had done something significant. Young guitarists everywhere were trying to cop Clapton's tone and phrasing. Drummers were studying Baker's polyrhythmic approach. Bassists realized that Jack Bruce had opened up an entire new vocabulary for their instrument. The power trio format that Fresh Cream established became the template for an entire generation of bands. Led Zeppelin, formed by former Yardbird Jimmy Page in 1968, took Cream's heavy blues approach and made it even heavier. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, also a power trio, pushed the boundaries of what the electric guitar could do. Grand Funk Railroad, the James Gang, Taste, ZZ Top, Rush, Motorhead, all of them owed a debt to what Cream established with Fresh Cream. The album also helped legitimize blues rock as a serious genre. Before Cream, white British musicians playing blues were often seen as imitators, enthusiastic but ultimately derivative. Fresh Cream proved that blues rock could be its own thing, respectful of the tradition but not bound by it, capable of innovation and originality. Music critics and historians would later recognize Fresh Cream as a pivotal release in the development of hard rock and heavy metal. The loud, distorted guitars, the extended solos, the emphasis on instrumental prowess over vocal hooks, all of these elements that would define hard rock and metal in the 70s were present in embryonic form on Fresh Cream. In 2012, Rolling Stone ranked Fresh Cream at number 102 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. In 2019, Classic Rock ranked it fourth in their list of the best British blues rock albums ever, writing that while the album struggled to live up to the feverish expectations surrounding the band, it is still one of the most important albums in 60s blues rock, and its influence on what came afterwards is immense. Colin Larkin, in the Virgin Encyclopedia of Heavy Rock, wrote that Fresh Cream confirmed the promise of their early singles, noting that Cream were not what they seemed, another colorful pop group singing songs of Tangerine Bicycles. With a mixture of blues standards and exciting originals, the album became a record that every credible music fan should own. But success has a way of magnifying every problem, and Cream's problems were already considerable. As Fresh Cream gained traction and the band's reputation grew, the tensions between Bruce and Baker didn't just continue, they escalated. The resentments over songwriting credits festered. The clash of musical visions, blues purist Clapton versus jazz rock experimentalist Bruce versus groove-focused Baker, never got resolved. By the time they were recording their third album, Wheels of Fire, in 1968, engineer Tom Dowd noted that the atmosphere in the studio had changed dramatically. When the group came back to record Wheels of Fire, there was a whole different set of circumstances. I knew that there had been some animosity among the three players, but when we would listen to playbacks in the control room, there were times when I thought they were going to kill each other. The relentless touring schedule didn't help. Cream was hugely popular, especially in America, and their management kept them on the road constantly. Three men who could barely stand each other, trapped on a tour bus, playing the same songs night after night, with no escape from the tension. It was a recipe for disaster. Ginger Baker later said, "The problem started very early on. Actually, the only thing that held the band together was its success. Jack Bruce agreed. In addition to the band's creative tensions, there really was a lack of foresight or belief on behalf of the management. We worked much too hard. 3 guys on the road, away from their friends and families for 3 long tours. That can be pretty destructive to a band. Clapton, looking back years later, offered his own perspective. It was very intense. It actually seems like we were together for 4 or 5 years, but in fact it was very short. My overall feeling about it now is that it was a glorious mistake. I had a completely different idea of what it would be before I started it, and it ended up being a wonderful thing, but nothing like it was meant to be. It was meant to be a blues trio. I just didn't have the assertiveness to take control. Jack and Ginger were the powerful, dominant personalities in the band. They sort of ran the show, and I just played. In May 1968, barely 2 years after forming, Cream announced they would disband. They would do one final tour, record one final album, and then go their separate ways. The music world was shocked. Here was one of the biggest bands in the world, at the height of their creative and commercial powers, calling it quits because they simply couldn't get along. Their farewell concerts at the Royal Albert Hall in London on November 25th and 26th, 1968, were filmed and later released. The performances showed a band that was still musically powerful but clearly ready to move on. The final album, Goodbye, released in early 1969, included both live tracks and a few final studio recordings, including Badge, a beautiful Clapton-George Harrison collaboration that showed what Cream might have become if they'd been able to resolve their differences. Cream lasted less than 3 years. They released 4 studio albums. They sold 15 million records and played to millions of fans. And then they were gone. Burned out by success, and unable to reconcile the fundamental conflicts in their vision and personalities. But Fresh Cream remains, and in listening to it today, more than 50 years after its release, several things become clear. First, the album's innovation hasn't diminished with time. Yes, we've heard countless power trios since then. Yes, blues rock became so common it became almost a cliché. But listen to Fresh Cream in context. Imagine hearing I Feel Free or Spoonful in December 1966, when the Beatles were still primarily a pop band, when the Stones were just beginning to experiment with psychedelia, when most rock music still followed predictable verse-chorus-verse structures. Fresh Cream must have sounded like music from another planet. Second, the album captures lightning in a bottle. The very things that made Cream unsustainable. The egos, the competition, the refusal to compromise, are audible in every note. You can hear 3 musicians pushing each other, challenging each other, refusing to let anyone else have the spotlight. That competitive energy is what makes the music so thrilling. A more harmonious band might have made prettier music, but it wouldn't have had this raw power. Third, Fresh Cream proves that sometimes the most important art comes from conflict rather than harmony. Would the album have been better if Clapton, Bruce, and Baker had gotten along? Maybe. Or maybe the music would have been safer, more polite, less urgent. The tension between them, between blues and jazz, between improvisation and structure, between subtlety and power, is what makes the album work. It's music that can't quite decide what it wants to be, and that restless energy is its greatest strength. Finally, Fresh Cream teaches us that influence isn't always about perfection. The album has flaws. Some of the originals feel underdeveloped. The blues covers sometimes feel like warm-up exercises rather than fully realized performances. Dreaming never quite achieves the ethereal beauty it's reaching for. The stereo mix is famously problematic, with its extreme panning making some tracks almost unlistenable on headphones. But none of that matters when you consider what the album accomplished. It opened a door that hundreds of other bands walked through. It proved that three musicians could create a sound as powerful as any orchestra. It showed that blues rock could be innovative rather than just reverential. It established that virtuosity and experimentation could coexist with commercial success. The story of Fresh Cream is ultimately a very human one. Three incredibly talented musicians came together with different visions, massive egos, and deep personal conflicts. For a brief moment, they created something extraordinary. And then, because they were human and flawed and stubborn, they tore it all apart. Ginger Baker died in 2019. Jack Bruce died in 2014. Eric Clapton is the last surviving member of Cream, carrying the legacy of a band that burned brilliantly and briefly. But Fresh Cream remains. In the power trios that followed. In the blues rock that evolved into hard rock and metal. In every young guitarist who learns to play Sunshine of Your Love or tries to cop Clapton's tone. In every bassist who realizes they don't have to just keep time, they can be a lead instrument. In every drummer who attempts a solo and realizes that Ginger Baker set a standard that's almost impossible to match. The album that three warring geniuses recorded in a few short months in 1966 has outlived its creators, outlasted its era, and continues to inspire musicians who weren't even born when it was released. It captured a moment when rock music was transitioning from its innocent beginnings into something more ambitious, more virtuosic, more dangerous. Fresh Cream wasn't just the debut album of a supergroup. It was the sound of rock music growing up. And more than 50 years later, its power hasn't diminished. It remains what it was always intended to be. The cream of the crop. Pure, undiluted, impossible to ignore. The legacy of Fresh Cream extends far beyond the album itself. It established that rock music could be serious art made by serious musicians. It proved that a power trio could fill arenas. It showed that the blues could be a starting point for innovation rather than an end point for imitation. Today, Fresh Cream stands as a testament to what can happen when raw talent, burning ambition, and personal conflict collide in a recording studio. It's not a perfect album, but perfection isn't what makes music immortal. It's the human struggle, the artistic vision, and the refusal to compromise that endures. Three men who could barely stand each other created a sound that changed music forever. That's the paradox at the heart of Cream. And it's the reason why, more than 50 years later, Fresh Cream still sounds fresh.